Okay, hey, we're back on to Division 1, Chapter 3, the worldliness of the world. And what on earth does that mean? So this is basically, when Heidegger says worldliness, basically he's talking about the world as seen, the ontology of the world, what the world is seen from a phenomenological perspective. So not the world kind of composed of just things around us, the way that science sees the world, but the world as kind of something that's lived, what the world actually is for a human being, and what it's like for a human being to experience. So that's what the worldliness of the world is, the structure of the world itself. And it turns out that this will actually be a kind of being of Dasein, actually, which we'll see at the very end. So there's the worldliness of the world, that idea of worldly, and that's what that refers to, this ontological, phenomenological, lived kind of structure of the world. But there's also another term that Heidegger introduces here, which is inner-worldly. And inner-worldly refers to the world of objectively present things, and kind of focusing on things, objects, focusing on objects, but from an ontological perspective, from a phenomenological perspective. So we have that worldliness, which is kind of the structure of the world, and inner worldly, which refers to things that are objectively present. So looking at the inner worldly beings first, what on earth? What are these things? How can we come to grips with them? So we deal with inner worldly beings, or useful things, it's another way to think of them, initially not by cognition but by a handling or a using or a taking care of, which we've already looked at with that in the last video, with that idea of phenomenological knowing. So that's how we engage with them originally. But what's their being? Well, what is the being of these inner worldly beings? Well, first of all, we know that they come in what Heidegger calls a referential totality. And so the idea here is that there is no such thing as a single useful thing, as a single inner worldly being. Inner worldly beings are they come in a totality in which each individual inner worldly being references other inner worldly beings. So there's this web of interconnected and interrelated inner worldly beings, and no single inner worldly being, the totality of all of these inner worldly beings is always already discovered before the individual inner worldly being. So what Heidegger is saying there is that the totality is always, we're aware of that totality, we're aware of how these individual useful things feature in that totality before we're actually aware of that individual thing itself. We come to the world with this understanding already in place, not the other way around. So we don't come to the world and see it as comprised of all these individual things and then try and piece together some kind of coherent picture. No, that's not the way it happens. Heidegger says we come to this, we come to the world with this understanding already in place. And if we didn't come to it with this understanding in place, the world would just be completely incoherent. If we saw the world the way that science tells us it is, It's just a collection of atoms, molecules bumping around, cause and effect, then that's what the world would be. It would just be this whirling mass of things bumping into each other and interacting with each other in various ways. There wouldn't be any sense to it, but there is a coherent, cohesive understanding, which is present, and which we're aware of before we're aware of the individual things themselves. And in addition, all of these inner worldly beings, they have what he calls an in order to. And this in order to is the individual thing, the individual being, or the useful things relation to its purpose, I guess, what we use it for. So, for example, the hammer, the in order to of the hammer is for hammering. The hammer is for hammering. That's its hammering is its in order to. That's what a hammer represents to us when we see it. And all inner worldly beings have this in order to, which is immediately apparent to us because we're aware of this referential totality. And so these ideas lead Heidegger to the understanding that the being of these inner worldly beings is handiness. He calls handiness. I think this is called in Macquarie and Robinson ready to hand. And this handiness is the kind of being in which a useful thing reveals itself. And it's this idea that the thing is in order to do something in this referential totality, in this web of interconnected, interrelated things which we can use in various ways. So that's what the being of these inner worldly beings is. And this being is revealed not when we just stare at the thing, but when we take hold of it and use it, or when we kind of engage with it, when we encounter it phenomenologically. Again, this is that idea from the last video, phenomenological knowing as opposed to the scientific approach. So Heidegger contrasts this kind of original engagement, if you like, with things, with the passive looking at, or what I called in the last video, lingering with. And he contrasts it by calling this more original mode of encountering inner worldly beings circumspection. So circumspection is the way that we are originally aware of inner worldly beings as being in order to do something in this referential totality. So that's circumspection. So in order for useful things to actually be handy, they withdraw in their handiness, leaving only the work explicit. So what does that mean? Well, think about a pen. So a pen is a inner worldly being. It's a useful thing with this being of handiness, and its in order to is to write, right? So when you are using the pen to write, you're no longer aware of the inner worldly being, of the pen. You're not aware of the pen anymore because you're using it. You're surpassing it, if you like. You're surpassing it towards the idea that you're putting down on paper. So you're in being handy, the pen, the handiness of the pen withdraws and we don't see it, we're not aware of it. It becomes a tool, a means to an end. And so in that sense, that's what Heidegger means when he says they withdraw in their handiness and they leave only the work explicit. The work in this case is like the project, what we're engaged in. So in this case, putting my thoughts down on paper. So this work contains the references in which useful things are encountered. And so the idea here is that we're no longer aware of the referential totality, we're not aware of the inner worldly being, the pen, when I'm actually using it. But the work, through the work that I'm engaged in, the project that I'm undertaking, that's how I encounter these useful things. That's the way these useful things appear to me. That's the way they're disclosed. Okay, so how are they disclosed? There are three ways that Heidegger mentions here, three references in which useful things are encountered through this, through the work that we're using them for. So the first is what he calls a what for. And this refers to the work that is actually to be produced. And an example of this is a shoe, which is for wearing. So that's the what for here. The what for is that it's for wearing. And a clock, the what for of a clock is for telling time. So that's the first way that inner worldly beings reveal themselves to us through work. The second way is a whereof, which is the using of something for something, and points to the materials that make up the useful thing. So for example, again, if we take the example of the shoe's made up of leather or rubber or something. Those materials are the whereof of the shoe. And finally, useful things are encountered through work as a reference to the user of the tools and the consumer of the product. So through this reference, work refers not just to more beings at hand, which the other two do. The other two refer to just other beings at hand, beings and inner worldly beings, but this last reference refers to beings with the kind of being of Dasein. So finally, work lets us encounter useful things as being for an end user, a Dasein, a being which is different from, or which has a different kind of being from inner worldly beings. And it's a lot of beings, That's a lot of beings. I hope that does make sense, though. In my mind it does, so hopefully it does in reality. The handiness of useful things, this is important too, the handiness of useful things is not like a characteristic that's imposed on beings, which we encounter kind of objectively. So it's not a simple subjective colouring of objectively present stuff. Because if this were true, it would mean that beings would have to be understood first as purely objectively present in that scientific way of viewing the world. But this contradicts Heidegger's whole interpretation of cognition as being a founded mode of being in the world, and which we talked about in the last video. So it's important to realize that inner worldly beings, or objectively present things or useful things, aren't things first which we then overlay with this kind of quality of handiness, that which we then give this meaning to. It's not the case that there's the thing first and then we just impose this structure on it. The things already have that structure. They come with that structure. And that might seem a little bit confusing because you're thinking like, well, that's not true. I mean, in order to learn what a thing's for, we have to encounter the thing first. But that's Heidegger's point, is that there would be no thing if you didn't already have this idea, this coherent, cohesive understanding of the world first. If you didn't have that understanding already in place, a hammer wouldn't be anything. It couldn't be anything. It would just be, as science tells us, a collection of particles. So its meaning, it's already there before we encounter the individual thing itself. And it's not that we encounter the thing and then give it this place in a referential totality. It's already there. It's already a part of this referential totality first, originally, and then we can discover it the way science tells us it is. But it first appears in this web of interrelations and interconnections that make up the worldliness of the world. Okay, so that's kind of those inner worldly beings and the being of those inner worldly beings as handiness, or I think ready to hand, as Macquarie and Robinson define it, translate it. But there's also this other interesting idea of unhandiness. These things can be unhandy. And the unhandiness of these inner worldly beings is apparent when these beings are unhandy, then they appear as merely objectively present. So that's kind of related to what I was just talking about. Originally, these things are handy. They're in a referential totality. They're in order to. They we encounter them through work, through projects that we're engaged in. But when they show up as unhandy, that's when we can see them in their objective presence, just as things, not as inner worldly beings in this kind of ontological, phenomenological understanding. So there are three ways that inner worldly beings can appear unhandy. The first is what Heidegger calls conspicuousness. So conspicuousness is when a being that is the situation when a being is unusable for one reason or another, and we come across it. So maybe it's broken, or there's something about it that means that it can't be used for what we need to use it for. Then suddenly it's not part of this referential totality. It doesn't fit anymore. Its connection to other inner worldly beings in this referential totality is broken, and so it stands out and it becomes unhandy. And then we see it as it is, as just, if it's a hammer, we just see it as this clump of wood and metal, and then it manifests in that kind of scientific understand through that. Then it appears as it does to science, just a thing. The second way is what he calls obtrusiveness, and this occurs when the thing is actually missing i.e. not at hand at all. So when it's not, when something's missing, then again it stands out and we become aware of it. And the third way is obstinacy. And this refers to the situation when a being actually gets in the way of us taking care of things. So when we're actually engaged in something and something is obstructing us in some way, then it becomes objectively present, and we see it in its objective presence. So these three deficient or privative modes of taking care bring to the fore the character of objective presence and what is at hand. And the structure of being of what is at hand is determined by references, which is that referential totality I talked about. And so when beings show up as unhandy, this amounts to a disruption of reference. And that's when not just the inner worldly thing itself, the inner worldly being itself, becomes explicit, but the reference also becomes explicit to circumspection. So we become aware of not just the thing itself, but the reference, the referential totality in which that thing is embedded. Because prior to that, we weren't explicitly aware of it. We were just engaged in the project. We were aware of the work that we were doing. So we were aware of those three things: the what for, the where of, and the reference to the user or the end consumer. But we weren't aware of the thing itself or the reference, the referential totality in which it was embedded. And unhandiness, as a disruption of that reference, makes both of those things apparent to us. So the final thing I've got here is, in this way, being in the world signifies the unthematic, circumspect absorption in the references constitutive for the handiness of the totality of useful things. Taking care of things always already occurs on the basis of a familiarity with the world. And that is a brilliant quote which completely summarizes everything I've said. I've talked about it for 25 minutes. I should have just read that right from the start, right? Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is reference and signs. So reference is a reference and the referential totality, the way everything refers to another thing, is constitutive of worldliness. Okay, which is, again, it's the ontological understanding, dimension of the world, as opposed to the scientific. It's the phenomenological understanding of the world. Now, signs, Heidegger makes a big deal of signs, and they're kind of unique because they are inner-worldly beings, but they kind of serve a world-revealing purpose as well. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So let's just look at signs first. So signs refer us to other things. Okay, so they point us in different directions. They indicate other inner-worldly beings. But they don't have their ontological structure in this indicating. That's their ontic purpose, if you like. That's their ontic role. Ontologically, their ontological grounding comes from the being of useful things, which is that handiness, which is that referential totality, the in order to that we looked at. So when signs refer, this is what Heidegger calls the ontic concretion of the what for of serviceability. And basically all that means is that what a sign does as a thing that refers or indicates somewhere or to something, that's just kind of its role when we're engaged in work, when we're doing things, when we're engaged in projects. Its role is this indicating to something or telling us to do something. So for example, the what for of the shoe we saw was for wearing. Well, the what for of a sign is if the sign says, say, has an arrow saying and pointing left, the what for of that sign is to go left. So it's just what the sign's role is within this work, within its as a handy thing, as a handy inner worldly thing in this referential totality. That's what signs, that's their purpose in the referential totality. But that's at an ontic level. So signs aren't comprehended when we stare at them as things which indicate other things. Rather, they have this other level, this deeper ontological dimension, where they're really comprehended when they're encountered in circumspect, heedful dealings that explicitly reveal the surrounding world. So signs let what is at hand be encountered. They are useful things which explicitly bring a totality of useful things to circumspection, so that the worldly character of what is at hand makes itself known at the same time. And that's what I meant at the beginning when I said they are unique, and they have a special place in Heidegger's in being and time, because they're not just other inner worldly beings in this referential totality which are used which are revealed in work and so on and so forth. Although they are that, but they also have an ontological dimension whereby they reveal the totality, this referential totality, this web of interconnections, because of their ontic, because of their ontic function as indicating, as referring. Their very role, their ontic role in the referential totality is to also, I should say, it is to refer to other things, like all inner worldly beings. All inner worldly beings refer to something else in their referential totality. Signs do as well. But they also, in doing what in referring, they explicitly refer to other inner worldly beings in such a way that the referential totality becomes explicit, becomes thematic for us. So that's why Heidegger sees signs as something kind of interesting, something kind of special. And so basically the idea here, what's important for Heidegger is that he's trying to show the difference between reference as ontic indication, which is what signs do, and also, I should say, reference as ontological structure. And that's also what signs reveal, because of the way they go about referring. They reveal this ontological structure, which is normally covered over, is normally unthematic for us. Okay, so that's reference and signs. Now, the next thing I want to look at, and the last thing we'll look at, the next thing is relevance and significance. Actually, this is the last thing we'll look at today. So relevance first. Relevance is called involvement in Macquarie and Robinson. I'm not sure which is better. Perhaps involvement's less confusing because there's already like referencing and referential totalities. So anyway, relevance, I'll keep calling it relevance, means to let something be together with something else. And basically it's a measure of the way useful things and tasks may be nested in other larger tasks, but with a particular end in mind. So it's the relation between inner worldly things and the end. The end that they aim for, the end in which towards which they're directed. So for example, the hammer is for hammering, which is for fastening something, which is for protection, which is for sheltering Dasein. So the relevance of the hammer comes from its being in this web of connections that ultimately lead to the final goal being for Dasein. And this is what makes the hammer, or relevance I should say, this is what makes it ontological. It leads back to a being that is ontological, that is concerned in its being about its being, right? Dasein. So the total relevance comprises a chain which always leads back to a what for that no longer has relevance. Because why does it not have relevance? This final what for? Because it's not a being that has the being of things at hand, or the being of inner worldly beings. Instead, it's a being defined as being in the world. The primary what for is in fact a for the sake of which, i.e. Dasein. So that for the sake of which is another hyphenated set of words. So it forms a single idea in Heidegger's thought. And that that for the sake of which is the final what for, the final step, the final link in a chain in which all chains ultimately lead to. All chains in this referential totality, they ultimately lead to a final one more what for, but this time this what for is a special case. It's a for the sake of which, and it's Dasein, it's that last one. So you got the hammer is for hammering, which is for fastening something, which is for protection, which is for sheltering Dasein. That sheltering Dasein is that last link in that chain, and that's the for the sake of which. And that's what gives things their relevance. So these totalities of relevance are always grounded in Dasein. Everything is eventually for Dasein. And that's why Heidegger claims that the world is in fact just a facet of Dasein. Dasein's being is being in the world. So that might seem kind of egocentric, right? And, we're the center. I mean, everything's for us. Well, I do think everything is for us, though. Everything, the world is as we see it, as we interpret it. Because we're the only beings that we're aware of that are capable of interpreting the world. We are, Dasein is that being for whom its being is an issue for itself, right? That's what makes us special, and it does make us special. We are the only beings like that we're aware of. Of course, certain other species come close. Perhaps they cross that threshold, so their being is a concern for them as well. It's not saying it's not an exclusionary kind of thing. It's not saying that we're better than other animals and there's something special. There's just something special about us that no other life form can achieve. It's not exclusionary in that way. Any life form can, in theory, achieve, can be Dasein, can be a Dasein. But the idea is that for Dasein, the world is for Dasein. That's the idea. and that's just the way it is. It's the only way the world can be. That's what the worldliness of the world means, is that it has this ontological grounding in a being which is ontological at its essence, which is Dasein. So while I do think everything is for Dasein in this way, I don't think it's egocentric, and it's not kind of a rash, prideful thesis. It's a thoughtful one which takes into consideration the fact that Dasein, there is something unusual about Dasein, something special. It's in its very core, in its being, it's concerned about its being, and that is something special. Its being, Dasein's being, is being in the world. So that's relevance, and now the final thing we're going to talk about is signifying. And signifying is the relational character of all referential relations in the world. So it's the way that all of those inner worldly beings, we looked at the inner worldly beings before when we saw them in the referential totality, but significance is the way that they're all connected. It's the relation between all of those inner worldly beings. So it indicates how certain ontological designations indicate or point to or signify other ontological designations. So he gives one, two, three, four, five different designations here, significances, I guess, significations. And the first is the for the sake of which is that final what for, which is for Dasein. So the for the sake of which signifies an in order to. Okay, and the in order to signifies a what for. Nothing new there yet. The for the sake of which is that the last link, which is for Dasein, and that signifies an in order to, which is the purpose for something. The hammer is for hammering. The in order to signifies a what for, and that what for was the work produced, right, with the useful thing. That was concerned with the work, the project. So the in order to signifies a what for. The what for signifies a what in of letting something be relevant. And the what in signifies a what with of relevance. Now Heidegger doesn't, it's kind of funny because these last two designations, the what in and the what with, he doesn't really explain that much. Or he doesn't really explain at all, I think. So if I was to put my own explanation on them, I guess that the what in refers to maybe a category the useful thing belongs in, the inner worldly being belongs in. So for example, shoes are in the category of clothing, or are they clothes? Things we wear, perhaps. And maybe the what with means other things that the item belongs with. So for example, shoes belong with socks. So there's a kind of connection there. So yeah, so those are the five ontological designations. For the sake of which signifies an in order to. The in order to signifies a what for. The what for signifies a what in. And the what in signifies a what with. Cool. Yeah. So significance, or the referential totality of significance, is anchored in the being of Dasein toward its own most being. Therefore it cannot have relevance. It is rather being for the sake of which Dasein itself is as it is. That's a little quote which, again, just means that this referential totality is anchored in Dasein. So Dasein kind of is what this all turns on, Dasein. And it doesn't have relevance, because remember, relevance is the relation between the thing and its final goal, the end point, and the end point is Dasein. So significance, the referential totality of significance, has no end point because it's everything. It's the world. It's the web of interconnected and interrelated things that make it up. So there is no relevance of the world. It has no end, final point in any kind of chain. It is all the chains. So that's what the referential totality of significance is. And the last thing I have here, it is only Dasein's familiarity with significance that lets inner-worldly beings be discovered in the world. Signifying is what constitutes the structure of the world, and since it is Dasein that endows or discovers inner-worldly beings with significance, the structure of the world belongs to the constitution of the being of Dasein, which is again just kind of me trying to summarize the idea why the world is kind of founded in Dasein, why Dasein is such a central component here. And it's because it's only that fact, that significance, referential totality of significance, because of that we're able to discover inner-worldly beings. So without that, we wouldn't be able to discover. We wouldn't know anything. We wouldn't. The world for us would just be nothing. It already must have that cohesiveness, that coherence, that significance brings. And significance doesn't appear from nowhere. Significance comes from Dasein. And so that's why everything is kind of in a way centered on Dasein, and why the world is grounded in Dasein ontologically. Okay, so I'm going to finish there with this one. This is kind of a long video. We'll finish this chapter, the worldliness of the world, in the next video, and then we'll move on to chapter 4. So cool. Thanks for listening. See you next time.